Hello everyone, going to do something different today, commenting on a video uploaded by the YouTube channel The Historian's Craft titled "Why Didn't Rome Reunify When China Did?" I would like to point out that it's a 6 minutes long video we're talking about, and I'm always fascinated when such broader questions are presented such a narrow time, given mostly my own habit of overstretching the discussion to the extreme. I'm making this video not for any specific reason of interaction with Historian's Craft. It can be, of course, like a welcome response or not, but it's technically not a video response. I just want to comment on some of the perspectives that this video, with at this point, after 1 week of upload, has more than 45,000 views. This may be a strategy for Schwerpunkt's algorithmic fortune to proceed like in the trail of more fortunate videos, as a matter of fact. But it's really actually an interesting point, given the fact that we, as you know, discuss mostly European history throughout basically all the eras, mostly through the medieval, the ancient ones, but also the early modern one, let's say. And we do have a series about Chinese warfare, not just about Chinese warfare, but the warfare of the peoples that China, this, as we'll see now, is an approximative term for the sake of discussion, was fighting against. So I will proceed, as I've done in the few video commentaries I've ever uploaded, by reading the video transcript that naturally I sort of matched with the right punctuation, and I listened to the video for that, of course. And regardless of the short length of this video, there is a point that makes sense. It's interesting to expand on. So as you understand, as we'll listen now, of course, like the same author makes it clear that this is just a broader reflection that cannot be discussed in such a short time, and that, of course, there are different ways of looking at the question, which is essentially the starting point also for my own video. I mean, there are so many things to say. I take normally more time for my videos, so this is definitely a good hint to start from. So the video says, one of the perennial questions that comes up in the study of history is why, after the 6th century or so, the Roman Empire never reunified the Mediterranean. I would like to point out, first of all, I will stop commenting naturally every step of the way, that there are some issues I do have with the way, of course, the general question is presented, but I will clarify all this at the end, right, of the commentary, at least when I will mostly speak my mind, say, as if I were to answer the question without having listened to this video, say, well, the aspects that I would have picked to answer the question had I had to make a video solely based on that. The part of the issue I have with this general concept is, of course, the fact that when we're talking about the Roman Empire, we are presented with a general paradox, that is to say that by the 6th century, essentially Rome, yes, was still within the empire, but wasn't essentially the force nor the actual center of the empire itself, and that fundamentally from the following one, this Byzantine control on the urbs was practically lost. I just made a video about the birth and the development of the papal states, to a degree explaining this also in other episodes, more focused on central Italy, on, say, Byzantine Italy at large, and how a great process of decentralization, as we know, especially starting from the Islamic conquests that sort of halved the geographical extension of the Byzantine Empire, were concerned. So the broader idea is that, of course, China is something immediately more cohesive, like right off the bat in a conventionally ethno-cultural linguistic sense, you can argue. It's a system that in many ways was paradoxically more sheltered and sort of more bottled, regardless of what we will see now is also an important point on the other side of the video. That is to say, it was also more exposed to a very specific steppe force that was apparently closer, in fact, to China in a more political sense, if anything. Then, in fact, this was to Europe, because also this video actually in the end mostly reflects not much on the Roman Empire itself, right? Had I had to answer the question, I would have mostly focused, in fact, on Romanity and what we would expect for the Roman Empire. In fact, after also the 6th century, this starts becoming something more regional in scale and placed again on a different at least national basis than the originary one, where we have a Romano-Italic origin of the empire that now basically does not belong much anymore to what is become a Greco-Byzantine empire. I do not know where the historian Kraft stands on this. I know he makes a lot of videos about the Roman Empire, about especially late antiquity or the migration era. So again, I'm not specifically seeking for a confrontation on this definition. In any case, I made so many videos on the topic. I do not need to repeat myself relatively to the general conventions here. Because it's obvious that, let's say, from the 6th century onwards, or 7th century onwards, like the Roman Empire is not even expected to essentially be reconquering, reunifying, as it's said here, the Mediterranean. Right? There are times in which the Byzantine Empire comes back, big time, especially the 11th century. At the peak, there are other phases before, like during the same re-expansion followed to the early Islamic conquest, then there was also the Comnenian era. So, but not even at that time, nobody is looking at the map of Europe and the Mediterranean simply saying, we're expecting now, or in comparison to power like powers like the Chinese ones, for this power to actually reunite the Mediterranean. Here, any kind of criticism I'm making may be also referred to the author of the video, but it's mostly intended to capture, say, the semantic shades of historical language, like as sort of frame to the topic in question, right, rather than something else. So if the notion is that we're looking at China broadly meant for the East, as we're looking for the Roman Empire for the West within Eurasia, something that of course the same author recognizes, it's really not really an equivalence or some parallelism that can simply resonate in different ways. Obviously also because the outcome is different, but because these two powers are different. And especially when we talk China and say, yes, there is a Chinese empire that routinely reunites, but of course this happens in a different context. That, as we'll see now, the broader explanation to the question is there was an external agent in the steppe that reunifies the Chinese empire. In my opinion, this is not really this is an important part of the story, but I would focus very much, like just from a methodological point of view, on China herself, right? In its culture, its sort of political, ethnic cohesion, religious thought, rather than simply why these barbarians from the steppe managed to reactivate this power, as opposed to a Roman Empire that left also very different marks and had started from sort of a very different place compared to China. If anything, the main comparison is obviously mostly between the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty of China, right? But of course, I don't have to explain this to the historian's craft. So again, it's just a criticism for the sake of a broader discussion. Also, because I was surprised, like how much of a perennial question is it? Why after the 6th century AD, the Roman Empire never reunified the Mediterranean? Was it meant? Right? It's more like a perennial question. Would be rather like, why did the Roman Empire fail or rose? Rather, or things like this. I had never. I don't doubt that there are some scholars that actually observed this and made a research on it, but of course we can find so many, if not infinite, perennial questions we want to find. Now, the video goes on and says, and this is often paired with an observation, mainly being that despite the fragmentations of the period of disunity, China always seemed to reunite. And this is fair. I think this is a fundamentally accurate proposition. I mean, we're still talking about China, of course, as we will see now. The same author points out, it's really like a periodical issue. There are some breaks and then recompactions. This is something that, of course, you can't quite compare the Roman Empire with in a strict sense, if anything, because the Roman Empire has just one big shot. And yes, there is the Byzantine half that tries to do something back, but fundamentally it's twained by another Western empire. Again, I don't know whether the author stands with this, but if you know my content, you know that I would point at to especially the expressing a metaphysical concept of Romanity that survived, especially during the Middle Ages, in a way that was, in a sense, favoring polities within the same Catholic empire that, if you know, of course, what that means, that were even incentivized to be that autonomous within, because of a principle of force, still within the unitary principle of the broader empire. And this is, of course, the medievalist talking, and you got to understand that. Now, the script goes on and says, before we get into this, I just want to issue a brief caveat. This is a question that does not necessarily have a specific one-size-fits-all answer, of course. After all, we are talking about opposite sides of Eurasia and timelines easily covering about 2,000 years or so, in part because China still exists and Rome does not, in fact. So I want to stress that this video is looking at a particular argument and a particular way of framing an answer. You do not have to agree with it, and it's not necessarily niche and every aspect correct. Granted, the argument that we're briefly exploring here largely comes to us from the work of Walter Seidel, a professor of Roman history at Stanford University, whose research focuses on the Roman economy and the comparative study of ancient empires, notably Rome and China. I would like to point out that the historian's craft has, as a Blockian, as slightly structuralistic by, so I've seen him making videos that delve often into some sort of socioeconomical direction. They tend to explain a lot through that, mostly. It's not that is not important, but I would, of course, always tie that to a more sort of political and moral connection and a reflection of one another in that sense. Nevertheless, it goes on and says, so I'm trying to condense a whole lot in a short video. Well, I would I would really say so. It's not the only thing his work discusses, but it is an important part of it. So with that said, now in Chinese history, one of the mainstays of the historiography is the dynastic cycle, the rise and fall of various dynasties. I think personally, as Schwerpunkt, this is very important to start from, and I would have liked to see sort of a bit more of insistence there, because as I pointed out, I would really and rather look at the internal balance of the system rather than some sort of tip of the iceberg, even in terms of tip of the balance as far as who will come to rule in China. So that, of course, external agency is important, but it sort of does not explain at the end of the day why these steps would play such an important role on China compared to Europe. And so even there, we're talking mostly Europe as the Roman Empire. I do not really blame the author for not expanding on all this, because again, he decided to make a short video, but I also decided to make it in fact more complex for my audience. Because the dynastic element, I made a video about the sacrality of imperial power in Chinese tradition a couple of months ago. There is, of course, they are mostly like something reconnecting even like the Eastern and Western tradition, so not much of a strict difference between the Chinese thought in essence, even though as we pointed out, in fact, in that very video, of course, you can perceive there the greater sense of subjection, of sort of apparently harmonic balance or stability that the Chinese Empire was, say, putting on the fore ideologically much more than much more, in fact, war-seeking, right? Even just in a vocabulary sense, in sort of the themes of my mythology, the general aspects of epos can be found in Europe. Europe was, you have the meme of China using pyrotechnics for fireworks, which is obviously not true. Of course, the Chinese use it for wide military use as well. But the Europeans choosing sort of the more impacting, gunning, destructive, explosive dimension. There is actually something there also. Apparently, as you know, the Chinese used much more, say, in proportion to Europeans, more sulfur than saltpeter. There was a more incendiary than explosive effect. That may have, just even from a technical point of view, like the idea of finding less resistance from within the same China. That, of course, you can't just demonstrate by such an idea, but that seems to be, as we'll see today in part, one of the main indicators of a very differently run state from Rome, and say the ones that actually Rome contained, also sort of went on after the evaporation of at least a direct Roman statal power on the same, which is also not much the point for helping my own idea, which is, again, insisting mostly on the fact that Rome did survive to a much greater extent than the one we conventionally understand. And that's why we can't just talk about Rome as an equivalent to the European Empire without understanding, in fact, what other European powers eventually kept existing in the wake of Rome, and it's not just the Byzantines for that matter. So the dynastic principle is relevant, to make the long story short, because, of course, it already highlights the idea of the kin, of everything laying under heaven. And so this much more precociously unitary conception of Chinese imperial power compared to the much more tumultuous Western Eurasian history. Regardless of the actual power showing, let's say, that at different times, in fact, could be equivalent, but still had this sort of phoenix kind of capacity to regenerate in a way or another. And it couldn't be like in a politically unitary way, but still has some substance that can't be stressed deriving just from specific peer states, as we will see now, and actually being part of something much more cohesively unitary. So this aspect of the Chinese dynastic history, the author says, although it's accepted, questioned, or rejected depending on what scholar you're currently reading, it's one of the lenses through which Chinese history has traditionally been viewed. Correct. I would say also that, yeah, it sort of more as far as what we historically know, what I personally know about Chinese history. I'm not an expert on it, but yes, there is a much more markedly monarchic direction in the whole kin than there is in Europe. Therefore, the dynastic continuity that the same Chinese empires tried to maintain, to stress also properly for its own legitimacy, seems like a good way of interpreting it. Naturally, of course, China was not made in a day either, right? It just was made much before anything unitary that, in fact, in Europe never really existed. We never really had a single, politically speaking, a single power ruling the world system, right? Not even at the peak, like of the most short living experiences. I don't know, just like the Axis. Like, you can't even talk, or Napoleon, about one single power that the entire Europe sort of identified with to begin with, which I would say, just from a cultural and ideological point of view, is a radical difference that in turn must be explained, of course, between Europe and Rome in this case and China. In fact, this is exactly what the author says. The history of Rome, and perhaps more broadly the history of Europe or the Mediterranean, does not have this. This is referring actually to the dynastic relevance of it. Of course, the Romans had their own imperial dynasties and houses, and this is not, let's say, radically different from China, except, of course, there we do see that dynasties having a greater stability or continuity. This is very interesting also within the Roman Empire. In fact, some actual distinction can be made in favor of the Western continuity of power when one looks at the unity of Rome, and the fact that in spite of civil wars, right, and moments of destructuration like during the 3rd century, Chinese history is more dynastic, but it does present with sort of more feudally localized capacity of uprisings of different branches of the dynasty, making leverage on particular parts of the broader China that does not seem so, in fact, personally connected like in Rome. Right? In Rome, you have some more traditional sense of statehood based not on a radically centralized or particularly, hierarchical or authoritarian compared to China, the type of power, but rather some sort of direct participation in the various chunks, the various provinces, to still the unitary idea that there is only one center, and that even though there is of course some regionalism and autonomies, fundamentally the unity of Rome is what Rome incarnates, even in the presence of such divisions, rather than a China where things were much more feudally decentralized. When you study Chinese history, the first thing that you notice is that there is a much greater similarity between, also during ancient history, with the European Middle Ages in the forms of government, in, say, the greater importance of cavalry, for example, the greater subjection of the peasantry, right? So that's something which I will expand on later, that Europe didn't really have up to this point, in that, in fact, Romanity in particular, say the conventional one, never really spurred. If anything, much of the Roman tradition survived, more concretely, not in the feudal element, but one of actual idea of citizenry, and this sense of actual autonomy, but of strong individuals that still identify with the empire exactly because of that, which is something that in China I don't think really happened, because it seems to me that it was largely a matter of being under some lord as a peasant, working in the rice pads, and essentially looking at who to support or not during the struggles that existed at the time, and then going back to your life without much participation. Rome has, arguably, of course, towards the late antiquity, the latifundium is something very similar, etc. But the level of per capita wealth that you have in Europe, in particular, in fact, in the very Italy, is something that will really not be surpassed by any other power until the 17th century, and these others would be still European ones, England and the Netherlands, and that's something that really never existed in the rest of the world to begin with. Like, India never had this, China never had this, and so there's a much more autocratic and authoritarian type of power compared to sort of what the European temper would have felt satisfied with, which is also true during probably the peak of feudalism, right? I made some videos about this, especially the Imperial Germanic Catholic miracle, which in parts explains what I'm talking about in the moment of, say, the evaporation, let's say, of what we intend as the unitary Roman state in the western part of, in fact, of the former of the empire, like what was in fact abandoned by a central government that however, was not even ever so central, in part allowing for this process to take place. And it's a very underestimated one, in my opinion, because indeed the continuity of Romanity is something more striking in that political and civic autonomy and liberty that doesn't seem China really could boast at any time of its history, right? So the script goes on and says, there have been attempts to reunify the Mediterranean as Rome did, and a non-exhaustive list would take into account the conquests of Justinian, the Arab caliphates, and the Ottomans. I would personally like to add that this seems like, of course, an idea that of course, the author acknowledges the existence of the other cases, but here we're looking at powers that paradoxically do not seem to have had much anymore, with that very center from which the Roman Empire was actually able to take over the Mediterranean and large swaths of the same Europe, right? The Byzantine Empire under Justinian was in many ways continuing in that sort of typically Hellenic legacy of coastal cities, scarce interland, let's say, homogeneity, and essentially just self-referential cultural attitude, at least also in a Latin legacy to that extent. It was one of the great peaks of Byzantine culture, the 6th century. And so, of course, you have a reconquest, but you understand that basically is mostly just a coastal one, and one that aims at maintaining, if anything, a control on the portual markets rather than, engineering what the Romans had done, especially in the West, the local populace in a truly, in a distinctively cultural sense. It is true, of course, that in Justinian's times, there weren't simply the resources to go as far as the Romans had gone, say, since the 3rd century BC, in that practically almost uninterrupted series of conquests of Mediterranean Europe. The Arab caliphates, which ones? Because if we are talking about the possibility of sort of hegemonizing like the entire Mediterranean, it's just like the first wave at the time of which the Muslims really reached the Atlantic and the Indus, respectively in the West and in the East, really could technically aspire to extending the Dar Islam to at least maintaining control properly, at least of the entire southern coasts of the Mediterranean, that were also not really capable of competing with the northern ones to begin with, not even at that time. And in fact, eventually with the immediate split of the caliphate into minor powers, yes, managed to infest with piracy, with sort of fortified rings where they stored loot and stuff like that, but do not really have the capacity of simply seizing major chunks of the European hinterland, with the only exception, again, of a power that immediately becomes separate, so it does not have the capacity to take over the entire Mediterranean, which is, of course, the Caliphate of Cordoba. That, I think, is very interesting. We'll come back on later, because why Spain, specifically? Why Spain, not Italy, for example? And, for example, the central Mediterranean, in that sense, remained much less possible as a launching pad for any kind of invasion. It's also true, in fact, that in that part the African hinterland is disproportionately smaller and less populated than anything of, like, in fact, the same Italian peninsula. Constantinople did risk to be wiped out at a point by the Caliphate, and there could have been really an idea of a broader reconquest, but it's not really done by a unitary power, at least one that can simply last as such. Also in the background, let's say if Constantinople had fallen at the beginning of the 8th century, maybe that would have provided with a massive elan to reinforce even the unity of Islam. But I don't think that Islam was really centered in a position that could simply aspire to take over the Mediterranean, if this is actually the point we're discussing. The same goes actually for the Ottomans, right? I think in that regard that of course, although the Turkish power was very strong, in a great sense, we're just looking at a continuation of what was the Byzantine regional sphere of power with Rumelia and Anatolia, and the rest was just a massive proxy that allowed, let's say, for, of course, an Ottoman domination, simply in the lack of any other, reasons to, at that point, fight against the same Turks, and actually enjoying like this vast dominion in its interconnection, and however without much of an activity possible. So the script goes on. Lots of things really that I should wrap up in the end, because that's the most interesting part of the video. It says, when you compare this to China, it seems that there was a more successful run of reunifying the core territory of China. Yes, which you could then possibly argue means that the Romans either did something correct or got really lucky, and then everybody else either did not replicate that success or they tried and then they did something wrong. So, okay, this is two parts. First of all, if you're talking territory, you immediately understand that there is no comparison between China and Mediterranean, because by your own words, you're actually comparing, of course, like not the Chinese mainland and, say, the water of the Mediterranean, but, of course, a concept of Mediterranean world that, of course, was wildly more heterogeneous than China. Again, China did have its internal differences. I'm not an expert in Chinese ethnoanthropology, but definitely by the time of the Hans. So when we're talking Rome, on the other side, had already been thoroughly compacted, right? When you look at this recompaction Mediterranean, of course, there are very obvious reasons why at large controlling it would have been such a successful endeavor for a major empire. But in that sense, you have also to wonder, how we can compare this reconquest attempts if we're talking, say, about, I don't know, the Islamic Caliphate versus what Rome had done. They came literally from different directions, let alone, of course, one on top of the other historically, with the Byzantine, Persian influence as well. But as in this last example, like there was an Achaemenid empire that was founded on the Middle East. There was, in that sense, also a same Alexandrian empire that did not really aim at united the Mediterranean, at least as a priority, as opposed to the conquest of India, or as a precondition for the conquest of India. As you know, Alexander was thinking about subjecting Arabia and then Carthage and then passing to India before his death. In any case, it's obvious that we're talking about different peoples. I mean, in the Levant you have Semitic peoples. In Europe you have Indo-European ones at large, and the languages are different, the cultures are different, the settlements, as we'll see now, are different. The interlands are different. So, yes, China is also very varied. We shouldn't sort of simply imagine like, the Chinese meme, everybody looking alike at Similia. But there is no doubt that in an ethno-linguistic sense, this was more cohesive compared to at least the Mediterranean, if we're talking the Mediterranean. Because you see, what I want to stress here at the end of the video is that there was a European power that we tend to sort of a bit blur when we look at Roman history, saying like Rome is fundamentally a Mediterranean empire, as if it not been a European one, right? Because you can't say Rome was, it was fundamentally just the city Mediterranean. There is no other further backbone or background to that Roman-Italic interline. I actually made a video explaining a bit that aspect from Indo-European perspective, that I think starkly divides the Europe and the Mediterranean in that sense. Actually, this sounds similar to the same conclusions of the video regarding the Mongols and China proper, but it's just something I will explain a bit better later. The second part of that statement instead is this wondering about how did the Romans get it right, really, and did they get lucky, or what is that they did correctly? Of course, there are lots of things that the Romans did correctly. I explained this mostly from a religious point of view, and this is really like a very sort of traditional Indo-European perspective of what Rome achieved in shifting, basically, again, towards an Apollonian celestial idea of power, reminiscent, in fact, of the same Indo-European ancestry the Romans had in the various steppes, and that already should tell you something about what I think about Europe as a whole, because if I do not distinguish, Europe from the Mediterranean, I shall not distinguish it from the steppes as well. Even though, of course, the differences existed, but the intersections there are obviously crucial in any case, regardless of the differences. And of course, Rome did a lot right. Rome, I would stress this aspect that is pertinent also as far as the end of the video is concerned. Rome did conquer from a specific, approximately national background. There is the Romano-Italic one, essentially other nation groups, right? This is how it happened. And it happened, of course, very late in time, by which China, again, was that homogeneous already, and did so by really co-opting all these various peoples to still keep expanding on the empire, and doing so offering a level of right and duty that is expressed roughly by in a legalistic sense by the concept of Roman citizenship, but it was actually reminiscent probably of the most obvious warband initiatic ritual of the Indo-European world, of the great, say, the war bands, the confraternities of warriors that these peoples were up to a few centuries before, which the Chinese weren't, right? It's not like, I don't know, in 400 BC, China was populated by war bands, at least to the degree, this was spread in the essentially tribal background of ancient Europe, including, a still pretty advanced place like the same Italian peninsula. So, of course, Rome did something which was giving it a redemptional chance, right? Not affirming, in spite of the Apollonian background that already, like the Dorians and the Italics had somehow cultivated differently from the Northern Europeans that have a sort of darker outlook on the world, and also for obvious reasons, like they were in the outskirts of civilization, had gotten the worst part of it after the Indo-European migrations and conquests. But this veritable sense that the world can be reunited by this massive push that fuels itself through this mechanism, and that at some point runs out of steam, right? Just like you can see it during the Carolingian Empire. In part, this is also for the Greeks in their particular ways with Alexander. But it has different, let's say, moments in European history that have always been inspired in a way or another from Rome, right? Even just in the symbology, in the kind of in the idea of imperial power, like Rome does not continue as a state, but it continues as a massive legacy in Europe as well, even in places that had not been conquered by Rome. Say, I don't know, the same Germany, at least in its completion, but I don't know, later on Russia, or you have the United States that have very explicit Roman traditional symbols and its institutional arms and more. And so there is something very clear about the difference in the way this imperial tradition, because this is what we really cared about. Also, the Chinese, really. It wasn't about the ethno-linguistic homogeneity. It was really about this idea of inner of actual nobility manifested through the divine empire, right? And again, there are differences in the way this was declined on the basis of the different tempers of these peoples, but we're talking about actually the same concept. You could go as far as saying that China itself was maybe an Indo-European foundation. It's possible, telling the truth. And in this sense, it wouldn't be very different by saying that truly that those steppes had founded those empires themselves. This is valid for the same Rome. Or if not in that direct continuity, still these peoples remembered this original ancestry, and they had even in the moment in which the pre-Indo-European populations were majoritary, they became European, interestingly enough. I would stress this because, for example, for China, again, we would go in very old times, but say it's not like you have a Turco-Mongolic or European, really, basis of power. China, whatever it is, develops with a very specific Chinese character. Well, Europe doesn't. Europe draws its languages, its culture, its broader identity from actually the Indo-European steppes. So that, of course, there are massive continuities also in the Pelasgian substratum and more, but that's something you may want to put in perspective, that we still speak those Indo-European languages as a consequence of the conquest of other peoples for which we also descend, that are in the sense as we are Europeans today. So I will not digress too much on what the Romans really did achieve in this sense, but I would stress the fact that the Romans fought their way through the system and molded it in their own image, especially in the West, which is, importantly enough, the one that would actually rise during the Middle Ages to achieve dominance and hegemony all over Europe and the Mediterranean through the Romano-Frankish civilization. Essentially, made lots of videos explaining how, aside from feudalism, the general Western brand of it, and the Holy Roman Empire, whatever your feelings are towards it, but also, the Italian trade and banking system. The same, the 13th century, yes, the Mongols managed to conquer so much, but at the same time they did remain in Mongolia and partly, again, ruling in China. Other dynasties settled into places like Iran. You have also at the westernmost fringe of the steppes, the Golden Horde, etc. But if you really look at Wu, is sort of culturally getting the upper hand in all this. Wu is actually expansive and even capable of pushing back to an extent we don't see just in the moment of the Mongol invasions, but actually because the Mongols at some point they really need the Europeans to an extent. I'm a military historian. I always stress how the Ilkhanate of Persia began to hire Western mercenaries, Italian marines, etc. So even like the word of the crossbow is actually prevalent, is actually more powerful after the first wave of the invasions immediately, or arguably even just during the same, as the Mongols really with Europe went nowhere, the one of the horse archer, right? So I would think that what Rome did here cannot, or what also China did, of course, or any other power did, cannot be simply measured by, what degree of political unity the system maintained, because in many ways that's fictional. It was fictional properly in the idea of tradition. Yes, there is an empire, but it's not like a red or yellow blob for Rome and China respectively that you can simply track in approximately saying, okay, these were respectively Europeans or whatever, or in Chinese, and going with, okay, since there's nothing else that calls itself Rome, or something that calls it like that but does not manage to reunite everything in a political sense, there is not another form of hegemony that, in my opinion, especially the West acquires in the Middle Ages, and that can't be even challenged by the Ottomans. Telling the truth, the Ottomans can be, it's a bit like the Mongols themselves, can be that aggressive at the beginning, can be that threatening. But as a whole, Europe is, even because, of course, this is recognized by the historian Kraft importantly at the end, of course, of the video. So again, it's not a criticism directed to him, but was much more impregnable than the Ottoman Empire itself. That in fact did not end well, whereas especially the most important chunks of what had been the Latin Germanic world live to this very day as the top qualitative powers in the world. Also their offsprings, like if you pick, of course, the same United States, the broader, say, let's call it Commonwealth, etc. That's another story, but still, and in my opinion, that should be a bit more recognized. Like that political territorial unity often does not actually correspond to some broader success in the in the qualitative element of these places, and can actually betray a much greater autonomy, especially when there is such an autocratic power like in China. It basically establishes major feudal chunks that to rule all this. In fact, this never acquire a broader sense of unity other than a dynastic one. That, of course, informs the subjects importantly enough, and not just, of course, that the Chinese are Chinese not just because of the Chinese Empire. Indeed, it's also from the bottom up as a dynamic occurring. But we tend to sort of, in my opinion, this is my general center when I, after several years of talking history on YouTube, that let's say people have the sort of paradox game mentality whereby, you know, if there is a blob that means power and they can't understand, you know, the power even of the universal influence of a single city. And I think with Rome, in many ways, that's also the best example in that regard. So power, cohesion, and broader hegemony are not necessarily stemming, in my opinion, only from a formal statal continuum, even though I, of course, think that you really must be a state of some sort in order to claim some veritable status of upper capacity. But when such states are so powerful at the point that they sort of recognize each other in a relatively friendly manner, like pick European history. There are lots of jokes probably from that statement. Yes, we fought each other all the time, but exactly for this. It's not like we were, different parts of a China. They truly didn't know each other at all, if not through their own rulers, and lived in sort of regional realities that were, again, run by this or that conqueror in turn. Like, if you have relations between France, Germany, Britain, etc., like, these are countries that really know very well each other, and they sort of coexist in, it's also pretty compressed space, in virtue of their own solidity, in virtue of their own success, and actually shared identity. So that in Europe, we, of course, achieved something very counterintuitive compared to the rest of mankind, whereby, albeit being politically separated, at least to a degree, that, to a subtle degree, we are actually very similar to one another, even in our differences. On top of our differences, we have also so much so that accommodates us that likely, as I've seen, like you can see it already when you start going east. This is true also for Russia, for example, but for China, I think this is, or India or other places, this is very evident that people internally do not really have much of a knowledge of their own country itself, right? They let alone the one of other countries to begin with. So I can't help to see a Roman factor in there, and in part I will explain this later. Now, the script goes on and says, this is where we get into the argument being explored in this video. This has more to do with the manner in which China was continually reunified, and then the consequences for the eastern and western extremities of Eurasia. When you outline the succeeding dynasties that successfully controlled what would be considered the core, quote-unquote, of China, what you're looking at is the following. The key point here in this particular line of argument is that after the Sui dynasty, there was a shift in where the military power during the unification comes from. In short, it begins to come from the steppes. So this is the point that the historian's craft makes on the basis of this scholar's opinion. That is, I agree in the general dynamic, of course, that there's a big deal of hybrid occurring in China during the migration era, by which fundamentally these steppes powers do not ever really leave China alone to a degree and aren't able to install dynasties. We've seen them often in our visible Chinese warfare to rule, especially the northern part for obvious reasons, but that fundamentally end up dominating, in fact, from the more warlike north, the sort of even softer south to an extent, comparatively between the two, of course. These dynasties, the script goes on, are not simple shift in rulership from one to the next. Very often civil war and imperial fragmentation is the rule here, not the exception, with competing empires often overlapping. So with that in mind, this is less of a continuous rise and fall of states and more of a competition of states, both ethnically Chinese and non-Chinese, over a long-standing political tradition and piece of territory with historically claimed justifications to rulership. Yes, this naturally points at the fact that China had such a huge imperial legacy itself, so that there is something comparable to Rome by scale. Of course, the merit is sort of the quality is different, as we will see better now. What I would also add is that the Chinese states that formed themselves after the fragmentation of the Boer Empire, during also the infiltration of these barbarians that come to dominate over parts of them, seems to be much more random than polities in Europe. Right? In Europe, basically, the major regional basins remain always the same. And this does not happen because of what will be developed further in the video, much because there was simply a greater stability in Europe that was apparently, and we will see how this is the case, in my opinion, less influenced by, by steppes invaders, but because these regions are really just continuing to this very day. I mean, you can make the case that since the Roman Empire, again, we said it before, Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, we have them today. And this is not such, just you can't say it's just geography, right? They happen in ways that we can understand, of course, through a basic historical, education. But this is valid also for other powers of the Europe that gets gradually civilized. And so when you look at Germany, that also owed a lot, of course, to Romanity, especially, in fact, what remains still to this day, the more advanced parts of the country. But even the later emerging powers like Poland, or the same, let's talk about Scandinavia as a whole, and there, actually, this is important. When you look at the Balkans or Eastern Europe, it's instead different. I would just mention Hungary, given that later we talk about also that particular basin, the Pannonian Basin. And this, of course, from one side shows that great part of Eastern Europe was destructured by steppes powers to a degree, and also that these steppes powers do not really manage to break through Europe for a reason or another. China seems to be more random in that. It's as if all its internal parts were interchangeable to a degree. There are, again, massive differences, but the way these empires gets parceled are something that in Europe I can't even think of, right? Even during, say, the Roman Empire, there were different partitions at a point, but they didn't survive if there was something really different from the regional basins that we're to see today. Even the Carolingian Empire split on a basis that apparently had nothing, or at least very few, to do, especially in the intentions of the same Carolingians, with creating, saying, a French or a German or an Italian dimension, but that somehow were already put on that track. That obviously was also the case because, at least a Kingdom of Italy already existed, a sense, of course, of the divides between Central and Western Europe already existed. Things are a bit complicated between France and Germany, of course. But in a way, the main regional pools always remain those ones, right? With China, it's as if, again, what the random autocrat warlord found a place to sit on, and without being overthrown by the other guy, and eventually, the entirety of China at some point managing to recompact. The more you study Eurasian history, the more you realize how actually similar the timeline, the dynamics of all these powers really were, right? We tend to differentiate a lot, mostly because of a deterministic approach. But even if you look at within the same Europe, say the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, you realize that they were, say, suffering the same issues exactly in the same generations. And even though there was a different outcome, this was not an outcome dictated by some irreversibly deterministic or such radically different dynamic as we tend to think, even though there were such profound differences. But let's say it's like the end of the western half of the empire. Does that correspond to some sort of major statal destruction? Not really. Actually, I made an entire video about this. Much of the entire notion that the Byzantine East was, by that point, so much more ahead or would remain also just in a couple of centuries that compared to Latin Germanic Europe, especially when you look at great parts of Gaul, Spain, or Italy, is not really that big. And it's mostly like, as Westerners, we really needed to make the East a much bigger deal than it actually was, and belittling our Western stuff, because we overthought about ourselves, and in part also we know much less the rest, and so by approximation, it seems as if our situation is much more nuanced and so distant from compactness and effectiveness, whereas the others were often, regardless of sizes, of geographical extension, were actually much more messed up and at least not so effective like we would be. And this is, again, a point that is, I think, espoused by the author of the video also at the end, which at least is also citing somebody else's presumably well-researched ideas. Like, I think also the author of the video has research in the same, at least in order to cite this properly. So here, repeating very rapidly, money continues rise, fall of states, or right. So the script goes on. The Tang dynasty, the Mongols, the Ming, and then the Qing, all either have familiar connections to the Eurasian steppe, come from the steppe itself, or otherwise come from the north of China in doing. Some parallelism could actually be drawn with Europe as well, given for example, the power of the Carolingians or the Holy Roman Empire, also in the later centuries, etc. It's the notion essentially that the Germans are more warlike people. They're actually closer to the actual steppes and take over the more civilized Romance world, and there is this hybrid fundamentally. This could actually have something common with China as a broader dynamic, but if so, of course, regardless of the fact that it's very different by degree, there is, in fact, first the Germans are more civilized, actually by the same Rome historically, to fit sort of the more sanitary world compared to the north, as very often the steppes powers rule in China but have their actual oil fields still in the steppes. Like they don't really simply move as an entire people like the Germans do, for example, into the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, right, if we level these differences to sound dynamic, what remains is sort of more relevant still. Again, this is not much about an external factor, but it's an internal factor. So why, again, did Rome never reconstituted, at least with that, an empire that could overlap with her historically, and to the same extent and duration and legacy from the former Rome, and why instead China more or less ended up recompacting in such more evidently natural way. Then the script goes on and says, so it sort of fits into this pattern you see in medieval and early modern Eurasian history, where many of the large empires seemed like they're emerging from the Eurasian steppe. In part, this has to do, yes, to an important degree, this is true, but in fact, we'll explain better now. In part, this has to do with what the anthropologist Thomas Barfield calls shadow empires. Essentially, there are groups of political units that we call peer states, and these are cities or small states that are just powerful enough to compete with each other, but which aren't strong enough to fully dominate the region. On the outskirts of that zone of competition is a political unit that is to a degree related to these peer states, but due to their position at the edge, they are able to, or perhaps forced to, establish a system of political and military organization which is slowly able to intrude upon and then conquer and integrate the weakened court. Naturally, this fits particularly well China, right? There are examples of this from ancient history that do not come from Eurasian steppe. The city of Roman Italy or the kingdom of Macedon would be two examples. Now, I would also like to point out that this is exactly the point, that in Europe we do not have this, which is also what author later recognizes, but it's the fact that that instead it's not explicitated here, if I'm not wrong, that is to say the fact that Europe managed to counter these powers instead. I mean, that these peer states do keep regularly out the steppes peoples, as a matter of fact. So what is recognized here is also the fact that Europe did not have some steppes base closer to it for actually threatening these powers. This is relatively debatable. This is, if anything, one aspect that gets down to the broader point that is made, and yes, so it's sort of a more shaded dynamic. Nevertheless, I would also point out that by the modern age in particular, like, it doesn't seem that there are empires made that are coming from the steppe. It's mostly like during the ancient world. Like if you look at the Medians, the Parthians, there is more of that to the Indo-Scythians, etc. During the Middle Ages, of course, the Turks, the Mongols, etc. But for the modern age, like if anything, you have powers that stemmed from that before, but it's not much that specific age. I would contend. So this notion that Barfield puts out is definitely not quite fitting the European case, in my opinion. Because if you look at especially the ancient or medieval times, you do not see such steppe element. Doesn't matter how actually very strong, like managing to actually destructure the sanitary world. That was not just Rome or the Mediterranean basin. It was just like, I don't know, the same, I don't know, the Celtic world, the Germans, other polities of sort were also very actually steppe influenced, and that's the point that we tend to underestimate. The other point is also why did China eventually succumb in medieval times to that nomadic pressure that, again, let's be clear, of course, China remains a massive civilization on its own, and these peoples are not substituting themselves to the Chinese or imposing their own politics or society. Again, most of their divisions are out there in the steppes, very close to China. So admittedly, yes, there is this looming threat on some of the most developed parts of the, let's call it the Chinese subcontinent, as if, I don't know, like Rome had the Huns habitually living just across the Alps in their ancestral homeland. This is not actually, of course, like a small factor, and this is what historians craft mostly as ultimately accounts as, this dynamic. But it still does not seem to explain why, still throughout ancient and medieval history as well, Europe resisted so strongly also to what was the possibility of a steppe infiltration. Like, say, why did, for example, the Iranians, that were originally the ones who had compressed the Turco-Mongols in the ugliest and most radically underdeveloped part of the steppes in the northeast, so actually close to China, did not sort of manage to make a breakthrough. I mean, they were just in Ukraine, right? So they were here. Yeah, there are not many other great openings of the steppes other than that, but it's pretty close. It's just across the Carpathians, and the entire Danubian area, the surroundings are the same Pannonian Basin, of course, are in part a continuation of that, and some states, the nomadic states are definitely established that, as we know, but they don't go that far, right? So why did also the Chinese exist fundamentally in the ancient world, and in the middle one they cracked, right? It's not so entirely clear. Also, especially considering that, of course, there is a general exhaustion of the system. I personally explained this through the actual, running out of resources of some sort. Some put the climate change in between. I think that human communities are able to mess things up by themselves without much of the help of a, external factor. And I attribute this also to a broader metaphysical issue with humanity. It's traditional, what tradition tells us all the time about the spiraling down of the generation, which is also part of the mythology of all these peoples telling the truth. Which is not just, again, it's a cumulative process. It's not simply like one of the given contingency. And so another aspect I would actually point out is that, as I said before, Europeans themselves are just like the product of an Indo-European invasion of some sort. So at some point Europe was overrun at the time of the civilization of the Mother during the Bronze Age, but these Indo-European conquerors that truly penetrate everywhere, right? Up to Ireland, up to Portugal. Like it's like all these is invested. Like there are some branches that pass, like first to the to the north, to the Corded Ware culture on the Baltic. They spread mostly like as a branch. Then they also descend down routinely. Then there is another branch that comes more directly instead from the steppes through the Balkans to other parts of southern Europe. In any case, that was a major breakthrough that you do not basically have anymore in European history. During the migration era, there's something similar, but it's actually much more contained. And actually, civilization survives all this, regardless of the fragmentation of the former territories of the Roman Empire, right? In any case, again, I disagree with Barfield's dichotomy, because I don't know to which extent it goes, but this idea of shadow empires and peer states is a bit too dualistic, in my opinion. Doesn't take into account important exceptions, or at least fundamental exceptions, as a matter of fact. In any case, we read this part. Yes, this other aspect. Like, say, there are exceptions to this. I think that Europe is a bit more comprehensively an exception than just Rome and Italy or the Kingdom of Macedon, right? That, in this sense, even though there were sedentary Mediterranean powers, were not just European and Indo-European, and carrying with them that sense of brutal northern kind of essentially barbarian conquered mentality that we sort of obliterated historiographically when looking at these peoples, especially in comparison to what we're doing literally up to a few centuries before as literal tribal warriors, in comparison to the more developed parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially, right? And so these are exceptions. The author rightfully points this out because they are essentially two powers that take over a massive dominion. However, I would point out that for the sake of discussion, Rome is the topic of this video, and in the western part of Eurasia, and that she takes over the Mediterranean. The Kingdom of Macedon does something different, right? The Kingdom of Macedon basically superimposes itself, at least its conquests, to the same Achaemenid Empire, and there is a great deal there of Macedonian control of all those territories, pretty far away, even with the Indo-Greeks, and then also the various Diadochoi more closely. Those were Diadochoi in part as well, but it's eventually not just the Mediterranean. It's not. Yes, it's still Western Eurasia, but it's not. Even there's something that you would so intuitively think, even less than Rome, and did think that should have simply continued. In fact, it didn't. Right? Macedon did fight its way through this territory, but this territory was not populated like Europe, by peoples that would be able to reestablish a veritable hegemony. Even the later Sasanian Empire or the Islamic ones seem, first of all, to have rested mostly on some prior regional basis of power, and they do not, as we observed, seem to be even expected historically to have had this massively cohesive capacity of expansion, right? Because the peoples that they ruled were very different, right? And much more diversified than within China. Like if you look at, I know that there is a northern part of China, as we will see now, that is like a huge frontier, and so it's very different, say, from the south of China. So there are these kind of differences, but it's much more gradually evolving difference through overall impressively homogeneous system. If you take even the Islamic Empire, look at Egypt or Mesopotamia or Persia, like these are peoples that historically hated each other, and they didn't speak the same language. They were sort of all different in nature and different influences. And that had also been historically, however, quite passive in terms of autocratic power ruling over them. In fact, it's very easy, say, for Alexander or Rome to rule over some of these peoples. And this is why you can't say, look at a Syrian or a Palestinian or an Egyptian and saying, well, this is essentially like a people so endowed with, by the time of the Roman conquest, with any sort of major strength and drive and sort of warlike instinct, like, I don't know, the Italics or the Gauls under Rome, right? So I would say that plays a factor also in highlighting the paradox of how such peoples, the former group of peoples, could be brought under the yet other untamed king of kings, pharaoh, emperor, whatever, whereas the Europeans could be together as long as they join this massive sort of warband conquest, preying on the rest of sort of the richer world that would bring the spoils of home, like almost a step people, like in the deeper sort of soul of their ancestral reminiscence, that were also quite explicit, telling the truth in terms of imperial ideology. I mean, for Rome is incredibly clear, but this is true also for the Macedons, etc. That, once that ended, reasoned mostly in terms of if we're going to have a leader, we're going to have one that we choose. And even though we recognize this is crucial and often forgotten in Western history, even though Rome remains the metaphysical ethnic standpoint from which being able to re-edify an empire, which also the Easterners in many ways are sort of aware. I mean, look at the Seljuks of Rum, right after seizing Byzantine Anatolia. They still recognize that there is a metaphysical Romanity there that they want to partake. One of the Ottoman Sultan's titles was, of course, Caesar as well. And so we're talking actually at a spring of power originating in the West, originating in Europe, that all these other powers somehow recognize, and that we decide not to recognize just because at some point we can't draw a red blob on the map of Europe and the Mediterranean and say, okay, so Rome is over, guys. It's just other stuff. It's kind of like all the different nations, right? Another thing. No, there was a massive imperial Catholic tradition living in the veins of Europe. The same Holy Roman Empire, to me, is truly a Roman Empire. Like, I don't think there are doubts about that. Just like the Byzantine one is, right? Just we conventionally call it in these different ways. I hope really it's not a problem. As I said at the beginning of the video, for me, the term Byzantine is wholly legitimate to be used in a historiographical context, in a moral and scientific sense, provided that you, of course, know what you're talking about. So the script goes on and says, but the point that this particular argument is trying to make, because I understand that this video is just like a broader reflection on the topic, so I'm not taking it so harshly or seriously at all, as I pointed out since the beginning. Now, it's trying to make is that after the classical period, the unifying forces of China emerge from the steppe and other large territorial states tend to be dotted along the steppes. So period of unifying forces of China emerge from the steppe. Okay, so basically that again, whoever was to reestablish some more or less complete unity of the Chinese empire was a steppe power, one historically or dynastically originating from the steppes. This, again, is true. And we could, as I said before, talk about how much, I don't know, of a Germano-Iranic culture existed during the migration era to refound a bit like the feudal, say the aristocratic establishment in many parts of Europe, right? That indeed remained civilized if they had been civilized by Rome, and that Romanity actually was very in the essence, like say in urbanism, in literacy, in the general, in fact, still international coordination. That was again much more robust than we think. I mean, look at the Church of Rome already in late antiquity, early Middle Ages, which was able to coordinate across the West. Something that notably Constantinople did not really have, right? That the spiritual centrality that Rome had still for the West throughout all the following millennium is undeniable, right? And is something that should make us think at that point what Rome actually was, what had turned into, other than, again, the continuity of a political territorial state of sort. And in fact, the author says, but this doesn't really extend into Europe, however, all that much there is the Pannonian base, and because he's talking about the steppes rulers, so where are the steppe rulers that rule these other guys? Yes, overall it does not exist, or at least there isn't an empire that fundamentally consolidates so even as an external reality capable of threatening the empire. I mean, the Huns were objectively some of the most overrated powers, like in the historiographical, say, cultural perception of what they actually could achieve. Like they didn't have the cultural capacity to destructure, nor the will, by the way, to destructure the Roman Empire as such. Like they did damage it, but they made the end that, of course, was pretty obvious. Say this, showing all the fundamental weakness of the same. Pannonian Basin, but the extent of that grassland is not overly large, and it's probably not enough to fully support numbers along the lines of, say, the Manchu armies during the Ming Qing transition period. Yes, all right. And it is true, as we were saying before, that if I have a map here of the Eurasian steppes, there is a general understanding that, yes, there is a steppe that proceeds very closely to the north of China, and so it's pretty extended, etc. But it's not so actually small compared to the other main, essentially central and western chunks of the steppes. I mean, the main chunk of the steppes in the west is definitely the Ukrainian one, and it's not that small at all. It could not really support more than the type of armies that here are essentially pointed out being say available to Chinese medieval modern powers. But it is also true that by that time a bit like the function of this all wasn't much having some real Mongol power ruling over China. It was essentially China by that point, we're talking the modern age mostly, capable of essentially supplying these troops in order to purposefully counter other, for example, steppe peoples at the same time. And still there is a gradual, of course, reinforcement of mainland Chinese power over the steppes during the centuries. Like this is also what happens in the West. Like the steppes are wiped out by pike and shot warfare under the Tsarist expansion. You have, say, this broader sense that the steppe is actually struggling to compete with the sedentary world all the time, right? Since its beginning, the steppes are actually the weaker part of the system, right? But some pockets can destabilize very vertical societies, like in this case the autocratic imperial China, to the point of maintaining this broader coordination across territories, because the system is well suited to just allow this to happen. There's also a lot of convenience, if you think about it, having the bulk of some power just in a precautionary fashion, like in the steppes already, and one within the same China. And so I think that this video should address much more, of course, like those real power dynamics, because it's clear, of course, from the historian's graph that he intends this cooptation of a court, and or at least the substitution, literally, of the local dynasty and China as the continuous power base. But in this sense, it's even less distant from Europe as a dynamic, right? And this flattens, yet again, the fundamental difference of why, the fundamental question of why the factors, at least the possible factors for which Rome and China were that different, right? So it is true, again, that but why would it have possible, again, for a Western Eurasian steppes power? Remember that especially the Iranians are the stronger one in the West in antiquity, to simply take over Europe. They don't even attempt that since sort of a much more primitive time, like the one of the Indo-European conquest proper. There is a lot of frontier space where there is a lot of hybrid and so on, but fundamentally Europeans maintain the upper hand, even when they are actual tribesmen or something barely more. I mean, in the Middle Ages, this is obvious. Like, even the Eastern Slavs managed to take over, say, the Kazakh Empire with the Kievan Rus. There is no further, like, even the Mongol invasions of Europe are just something preliminarily testing the possibilities of having anything to do with this system as possible subject of tributary. And fundamentally, the Mongols fall back and do not come back also, yes, because there are some specific political contingencies to that, but they do occupy the steppes. The steppes remain always controlled. Actually, you have this interesting Mongol rule over what are more than Mongols, Tartars there. Of course, there couldn't be even an ethnic substitution in the steppes itself. And it is true that the Mongols came from the other side of Eurasia, so this made things even easier for European in hindsight. However, we understand that Europe was really never, say, particularly affected by this broader dynamic, likely for two reasons. The first one, I would say, it's a moral factor. I believe that Europeans were much more warlike than the Chinese on average. And so they understood much better what sort of their place in the world was in a politically autonomous way than the average Chinese peasant work in the fields, right? Any system that fundamentally sclerotized in the latifundum suffered of an incapacity, if anything, of simply maintaining a firm control on its territorial reality. Even Constantinople, that was a bit more of a hybrid with a more exquisitely European dimension, actually survives because of the centering of the system around Constantinople that actually dries up, for example, the same greater, apparently greater level of urbanization, by the way, compared to the West, which is debatable, in my opinion. In the 6th century, actually, the largest cities in the empire were in the West, were not in the East, still or ever. And the general tendency is the one of, again, sclerotizing the system around Constantinople, by which you can defend this Alamo of the Alamos, and still having an interland that, in the typical Greek fashion, you do not give a blip about, and that, in fact, is also very heavily affected by the steppes world, and that gradually gets a bit eaten up by that. In the West, you don't have that. In the West, you have a prevalence of veritable autonomous liberties, even in the most feudally monarchic systems, that keep cultivating essentially a backbone of fundamental freemen in arms, right? That yes, for a time they're more depressed at the beginning of the Middle Ages, then they sort of come back in a probably underestimated way. They're not able to routinely challenge the establishment, but surely the establishment was also product of part of that kind of settlement between very powerful realities. The nomads really do stop to the steppes in the West. If you look at it, there are some sort of important in-betweens, of course, but mostly towards Central Asia, right? And in areas, in fact, that were historically much more destabilized by the same steppe and or not so productive. Like there are some, caravan centers along the intercontinental routes and so on. The military history of the West, however, witnesses like essentially an incapacity of steppes peoples to simply break through, to even be able to settle anywhere but outside the steppes. They exploit all of it. There is actually a lot of nomadic influences up to Central Europe, even Germany. You can argue that look at the Hunnic Empire, at least the tributaries, they had really stopped to the Rhine in many ways. Some people talk also of Scandinavia to an extent, but that's mostly also not a direct control. The bulk of Attila's empire was in the really in Hungary, it's like what would become Hungary. And this other aspect is, of course, environmental, and so it makes you wonder why, let's say, China, in this sense, was so much more exposed to, instead, a greater steppes success. And I think it's equally for the same reasons, right? There may be some that I don't believe in geopolitics to begin with, so there may be some important factor in the closeness of let's say, of the steppes to northern China, and probably a corridor really between the Pacific and some steppes of inner Asia that there highlights the strategic relevance, right, of northern China on the longer run to contain the steppes when the steppes peoples when they were bottled into that. But it's as if like the eastern steppes were much more primitive and savage, and therefore less effective even than the western ones, that in many ways may have even gentrified historically. This is definitely a dynamic that is there for some Indo-European Turkic elements, especially. We're gradually feudalizing, sanitarizing in the western steppes towards their last, and definitely equating to a sort of end, of exhaustion of some sort. But in this regard, it seems to me that the main divide is the main difference is between Rome or Europe and China, is that China was actually much more sheltered as a system, aside from this northern part, that once you managed to break through like this first defenses, you would find there were many layers, admittedly so, but including parts in which the Mongols lived in, say, not in their own cities, but in places sort of a bit in the middle of nowhere that were a bit urbanized even. But this does not compare, of course, nor by size of territory, nor by, say, demographics or productivity and so on with the rest of China. And so the impression I have, definitely, is that the Chinese were much less warlike in terms of violent rank trooper or individual. Like they were much more like peasant levies than what you see in Europe, especially in already from the ancient world. This is true actually for the Middle Ages. We would say, oh, but the Chinese had so many, great inventions. They would have so great technology and advancement and power. And if you look at their art, indeed, like they're sort of much more sophisticated to an extent to the same Europe, especially during the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. But at the same time, one has to realize that great part of what we see there comes from a hyper elite. It's not like the average Chinese person, again, had the same level of per capita wealth than a European had, even at that time. And that, paradoxically, from a documentary point of view, can create historical and archaeological sort of misconceptions. You understand that these are enormous topics to address. So, I don't, believe me, I don't do it in a light-hearted fashion. But at the same time, this is really the impression I gathered from any other basic indicator that I could see. Again, it is true that the Turco-Mongols awakened. They're much closer to China in their original steppes abodes than to Europe. And Europe, again, does have an important level of an important closeness of the steppes. It's not just like China. You can argue that there is some similarity even in between Europe. I mean, if you look at southern China, that would sort of give up more easily, as we've seen, for moral reasons compared to the more militarized north. But it's essentially the least influenced part of the country compared to the steppes. It's a bit like saying, in spite of the actual greater military effectiveness throughout all European history, and in spite, again, of the less militarization compared to, say, Central Northern Europe, what the west of Europe does. I mean, Britain, France, Spain, Italy do not get touched, basically, by any consistent nomadic phenomenon. Germany does. Germany does get harassed by the Avars, by the Magyars. It risks being effectively destabilized for a long time. Definitely, great parts of Central Eastern Europe or the Balkans are destabilized by the same reasons. But just to prove actually how far west the nomadic pressure could arrive, another factor could be, of course, that Northern Europe, to an extent, was not so appealing to a nomadic conqueror compared to the more concentrated riches of sort of southern Eurasia. In comparison, this is surely also another factor. But again, in my opinion, the major divide is moral in nature. The Chinese are more like somebody else's followers. They do not have that level of greater autonomy or liberty at a communal level from a military point of view, for example. And so even though they have a great power altogether, and of course there are very powerful dynasties and cities and regions and so on, but the majority, the fabric of it, is truly just more like the guy working in the rice fields, right? And it's I don't think it's a stereotype. I think it's really what you see even just from the composition of their armies. For example, what's the greater cavalry in the ancient world? You would say, oh my God, the Huns, they seem really more advanced even than the Romans to a degree. They had at least certain pieces of equipment that the Romans had yet to sort of to refine. Yes, but we're talking about pieces of equipment of an elite, not very different from the one, in fact, you would see in medieval Europe, except medieval Europe has also much tougher communal forces that develop in parallel to the elite. Right? This, I think, is very important. Like this is also an important difference between Latin Germanic Europe, that is also the more spared from the nomadic investments in the Byzantine Empire, that the Romano-Frankish feudalism develops an incredibly powerful elite, but does not choke local autonomies. On the contrary, these autonomies develop dramatically and in parallel to the elite, right? And even if they are largely subordinated to it most of the times, doesn't mean that they were actually, let's say, compared to the kind of peasant levies of China that didn't really have that form of association and political liberty. And that, in my opinion, reveals a much higher degree of militarization of Europe throughout all antiquity, because most of those peoples in Europe were also just tribesmen, warlike tribesmen that were surely more primitive than, say, the Chinese to an important degree, but they were also sort of younger, fresher, more active, aggressive people that Rome also manages to channel in order to to affirm her expansion and rewarding, and combining this element of modernity and one of tradition in a citizen soldier idea that combines also very differently from the Greeks, and this is very important also for the development of the later Byzantine world as well. Thucydides could arrive to think that only discipline counted in the ideal sort of Hellenic mentality. The Romans would have never thought that. They thought that discipline was more important, or better, that discipline and the virtus, of course, were to be in parallel, but there were two elements of what made, in fact, the imperium. In that hierarchical sense, but still making leverage on the probably on the warlike element of even incredibly well-disciplined fighters like the legionnaire, as if they had been still warriors, but highly disciplined warriors. In China, you do have similar. I mean, the Chinese military was incredibly powerful. The hands were amazing, and more. And the Chinese throughout all ancient, medieval, and also modern history were maintained very high standards. There is no doubt that China is the best comparison with Europe you can make in terms of civilizational achievements. But again, the basis is dramatically more detached from the elite and sort of more subservient and more dependent on, which does not happen in Europe, which, as you understand, has major implications for how this, so also the political landscape of the country would develop. Again, we're not looking here at different Mongol or Chinese states that battle just for being on top in the end. Europe is able to have an idea of empire and Christian society that travalicates the same national differences and creates very unified systems of development, from script to general, knowledge preservation to religious doctrine, right? And even in the moment in which this breaks during the Reformation, basically what had been in part compressed, let's say, by the initial unity, takes off, and to a degree that is in the sport of which like it takes over the world, and basically China does not get conquered by Europe, but very much sort of loses in many ways and gets westernized in a broader sense. And I think that this comes straight from the millennia before, right? So it would be interesting here. There is always yet another question to ask. Let's say, how did China form in that way? Actually, the ultimate paradox that I pointed out before, it seems to me that Europe develops in this way exactly because in the older time, probably in the genesis of what it means to be a European, was much more impacted by the steppes and their warlike ethos and autonomous liberty is still reprised today than China. That sort of got always bottled up, was threatened by external forces, was even maybe founded itself by a nomadic dynasty, even maybe an Indo-European one, but did not witness any major infiltration to mold simply like an ethnic system that you can't recognize coming directly from the steppes, right? It seems that lower bulk of less militarized elements was always much more majoritary in Europe. And this is quite interesting because it's not just about the difference of, because this is that's also how the historian's craft video ends. It's basically saying that European Western particularism basically has a lot to do with giving each other a tough time in modern Europe, remaining separated states. But at the same time, of course, there is, I know the author acknowledges all the previous bases, the same Roman influence, Hellenic thought, and more. But it's also accompanied by a very strong cultural homogeneity in so many effervescent, autonomous, and cooperating elements in levels that make Europe that more powerful, right? It's as if China had not evolved as China, but all different states that, however, at some point take off, albeit being also similar among one another. Instead, you have notoriously a China that ends up apparently sclerotizing itself because of some sort of broader isolationism or fear of the external. Whereas it's as if the Europeans had always been exposed to some sort of clash from more or less far away enemies that are also, however, well known to an extent, right? So going back to the script, that is wrapping up the thing. That is to say, so you end up with the argument that essentially it's the proximity to the Eurasian steppes along a wide frontiered zone that enables steppe-based political units to impose hegemony, or at least the northern half of China and then eventually the southern half as well. Again, this is methodologically saying, okay, I will accentuate other factors in the sense that at least I think that this is the most important one. But it may be, I don't know, do you need 50% plus 1 to make that? It may as well be that the proximity of the steppes was just that 1, and that there is an iceberg underneath beneath the water that is much bigger, great part of which in turn rests on a moral force that basically dictates the circumstances here, right? I can't think specifically why China, you see, even say the Mongol conquests are the more impressive, without mentioning, of course, that before the Kingizids there were other Mongol dynasties that had already been ruling over parts of northern China. But in fact, this situation had just occurred after the collapse of what had been great part of the integrity of the former Chinese, say the ancient Chinese empire. This would be really interesting to analyze, because in the West we can make many cases regarding what constitutes true Romanity. Think about the Byzantine issue and how different, of course, like even language was from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and at least to an important extent, but the identities especially. So it would be really interesting for China to scope this, except I presume that we don't really, in fact, have that kind of individual sort of autonomous criticism that you can find in various contexts, or even early medieval Europe, whereby, I don't know, an Isidore of Seville, Paul the Deacon, a Gregory of Tours, a Bede the Venerable, from important backgrounds, but still ones that are not the ones of the great Chinese imperial court. In fact, without all the restraints and sort of, styles that constricted any further expression. Just this is very evident for Byzantine literature compared to Western one, right? Really can't arrive to us, because I think we don't even have that kind of information. We don't have that for China. And for these exact reasons. It's a bit like, I don't know why we know so much about the Ottomans, mostly because of what the Westerners said about them rather than actual Turkish sources. There are also much, but this is true also for Islam, this is true in general for the Caliphate, for Persia, right? So I would, in that sense, consider, and I will get also to the point of this all, what we can think about the reunification of Rome. At which level, at which stratum we can think that having happened or not happen, right? So the conclusion of the script is the Mediterranean does not have this sort of frontier. This isn't to say that China is simply open to the steppe. There are certainly plenty of geographical barriers in place, but after Rome, the Mediterranean is never again able to come under the hegemony of one power, although it's not for lack of trying. This is probably, in Kyle's view, a good thing, because the ensuing competition among the European states, due to the general lack of territorial core that is continuously fought over, encouraged the growth of those individual states, and ensuing conflict eventually result in the very late medieval and the early modern state building projects, with the result of that being Europe and eventually the world as we understand it today. two very important points here before I wrap it up. Let's say the way the script sounds, at least, is as if, the fact that Rome, let's say Europe, did not have this frontier of the steppes, which is very debatable, by the way, close at hand, prevented from Europe to be essentially taken over by a major nomadic dynasty that could simply rule over the entire system, right? This is a very big deal of a claim, to say the least. I disagree with it, telling the truth, because I don't think this is true. I think that whichever power could have simply existed next to the core of Europe, and we've seen it with the previous powers that were listed before as well, from the, with the same Constantinople, paradoxically, which was definitely European, but also reattempted this conquest, or the caliphs, or the Ottomans, or the same Mongols to an extent, is really unlikely that any of these powers would have been able to have themselves accepted to begin with by the Europeans. I mean, the European mentality here is far beyond. I mean, when the Mongol Khan knocks at the door of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen and the Pope, Frederick II answers, "Oh, well, I will gladly renounce to my empire if you let me have a post as a falconer at your court," which I think that went unanswered. We know that the Pope responded, but we do not know specifically what. Basically, he told to go blip themselves. And in general, regardless of people will start, I made an entire video explaining why the Mongols, in my opinion, could have never conquered Europe to begin with. And there's a pretty powerful explanation of actually the bulkiness of Europe. Like this kind of, the Europeans did not have this frontier area, or which is not even technically the heartland, even I think for China, according to the video, like of the actual peoples that conquer. You see, for example, the Kingizids were pretty far inland compared to China. We're really next door. I think we shouldn't overestimate geographical issues here. Like if a steppe power had the capacity to penetrate into either China or Europe, it would have done it regardless of geographical barriers. I mean, this would have played, of course, a very important role in a sense, but politically, hell, we have the Scythians that make entire tours of the Middle East, raiding, plundering, etc. You think that, if somebody had, wanted to enter Europe or China, like there would have been any kind of obstacle? I mean, the Mongols there tell it all. They can go back and forth very easily across the two extremes of Eurasia. It was a massive feat, right? But the general sense is that even within the steppes, there are some powers that change over time. And the fact that, for example, China was even just preferred over to Europe in a greater sense, I think it's not just because the Turks and the Mongols were closer initially to the east, to the Eastern Empire, right, than the Western one. It is true that this may have, of course, played a role. I said it before, but what I mean is, if you look at Europe, the steppes are actually also pretty close. Like you can't find, actually the Western ones are better steppes historically. They may have been overly exploited initially, in fact, by the Indo-Europeans, that were the ones who sort of had the most glorious period compared to the Turks and the Mongols that were sort of more primitive. They got these bigger shots, but they also crumbled earlier in terms of territorial and general, say, ethnic hegemonic control, and in part also because civilization was ramping up fast. They were not the strong between the two, and so the answer must be political and moral, right? I don't think that Europe again was the place where you would simply want to even try to settle, and the Mongols realized that when they arrived there, right? They did something very also relatively unusual for their standards. I mean, somewhere they should have stopped, right? But this fact that they made this massively coordinated tour of Central Europe, skirting Germany, and in part sending some detachments across the Alps into Italy. And yes, they defeated the Poles, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Ruthenians, by the way. But this does not actually allow them to settle even into Eastern Europe. They settle in the steppe. They do not enter the world of the forest. They enter just maybe to exact tribute, but they're also pretty scared of that. And yes, again, the 13th century Rus was not so appealing like, I don't know, China. But this, however, reveals some broader approach that ultimately fails short of every expectation. I mean, Poland was invaded thrice, and all these invasions were gradually weaker. This is also normal, like you have the first push and then gradually simply realize it's not worth it even. It's not just because you exhaust yourself in the longer run, but because, it doesn't work. You know how advanced Europe already is in a global sense. I mean, the fact that the Ruthenians ask for the Pope to convert, to re-enter, let's say, the Uniate Church into the Roman one. Poland is devastated by the Mongols, but it comes back on its feet. Like it wasn't the end of Poland. The same goes for Hungary, right? They actually recovered fairly well, especially the latter. But in this sense, I see something much more permanently stable, as we were saying before, in these smaller European chunks that in many ways were still continuing, especially in the West, the Roman legacy. We talk about Poland, Germany, Hungary. These were even places that had been previously civilized. They emerged just in the High Middle Ages as such, and they're civilized still by the Franks, by Rome, by the broader Western Empire, that in the meanwhile is actually a Roman Empire. And again, I'm not going to turn this video, so because it's almost like it's too long, into the debate of whether the Holy Roman Empire is actually the Roman Empire. To me, it is. And it's not a matter of, say, factional, position, just per se. Like, I made hundreds of videos about the Holy Roman Empire, and I have sort of my ideas on the topic. So, this first idea that the steppes are so distant from Europe after all, or there are less geographical features than China. If anything, it seems to me that the contrary is true. It's just what you find there that may be more or less difficult to penetrate. In this sense, in terms of cost-benefit ratio, not really that appealing, right? And again, it's not like China becomes Mongol, as we know. Even after the conquest, like the massive Mongol power is in the north, in the frontier, in the barely steppe, right, world. The rest of the sanitary system still works to maintain this whole hierarchy that still lives in the imperial Chinese palaces of the great capitals of the empire, of the king. And so. At least the way the historian's craft phrases this in the end, it's as if, again, it's good, of course, thank God that, I don't know, we were split states in Europe. Yeah, but say the alternative seems to be like, in order to have an empire, there would have just had to be a nomadic overlord to keep us together. I don't see it historically. Not just because it didn't happen, of course, but because I don't think it really depends on that geographical dimension. Without mentioning that, again, Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans are constantly infested by nomadic elements. I made so many videos about these areas during the Middle Ages up to very late in time that there are these guys around all the freaking time, right? Essentially, again, Germany and Italy, by longitude, are the last sort of places where you don't really see that degree of broader destructuration because of the nomadic element. And actually Germany did suffer that more, right? Italy remained instead very much bulkier. And this also, by the way, has reasons that, as the same Magyar invasions show from a geographical point of view, are not dictated by geographical barriers. If a conqueror wants to sweep through because the peoples do not react to that, they will do it. It happened during the migration era, it happened during the second invasions. In China it happened as well. It has nothing to do really with the degree of distances to cover. It has to do with the degree of moral resistance that you find. That translates itself in terms of political cohesion, right? In many ways, if you look at European history, all the major nomadic or external intrusions were in part dictated by even the explicit will of specific elements within Europe itself, that when decided to, turn the flow off, like stopped everything. This is especially true during the second invasion. It's self-evident, really. So, this is my point. My other final point, in general, is that, you see, we haven't really talked about Rome because the text itself does not really talk about it, right? This question was like, why did Rome reunite? I know there was this comparison with China in mind as empires, but I think that this has mostly to do, given the fact that Rome did not reunite as we intended, at least here, conventionally. It's mostly like a European problem, not a Roman problem, right? Also because China, too, gets recompacted, but it gets recompacted often in only partially. Like there are some parts of the interland that are still in somebody else's hands. There are all these splits. There are also some historical regional realities within the same, with cultural divides and so on. Regardless, I would point this out. Studying the Middle Ages, there is again this catastrophistic idea of the medieval era, that especially for the 13th to 14th century is diametrically false to every level, right? By that point, which is maintained by the Europeans later on, regardless of things like the Ottomans in between, the Europeans at that point take the Atlantic route. There were ways to fix this, but in the heart of the Middle Ages, the great medieval civilization of Western Eurasia is Europe. There is no other. Like, you can't say that Persia or Egypt or whatever can't compare. In strictly civilizational terms, there is no such thing like the ensemble of Western Europe. There is no such thing like the grandeur of the Capetian monarchy or the wealth of the Italian communes. And all of this happens taking over Constantinople. It happens hegemonizing, economically speaking, like through banking and trade, basically the entire Europe and the Mediterranean and beyond, right? Because the Italians arrived as far as China. The Chinese did not really have the same capacity, but let's not even talk about during the Pax Mongolica how many Europeans lived in China. This is another story, but I mean, the Levantine markets depend on Europe, North Africa depends on Europe. This is a narrative that people do not really embrace very much because they think, no, it was like us, the Christians, and from the other side there were the Muslims. We were dominating. Like, Western Europe, in the heart of the Middle Ages at large, as the Middle Ages as well, is hegemonic over Western Eurasia. Just very much like the Roman Empire was. You can argue that the Roman Empire controlled the Levant, whereas the Westerners with the Crusades succeeded for a while but bailed out, but still the ports are in the hands of the Italians. Again, the level of wealth, military power, general technical development. I mean, by the 13th to 14th century, you can say that China parallels that, but surely in the western part of Eurasia there is none of it. None of it. And I have actually some reserves for China as well. what does this mean? It means that when you look at the actual center of the same empire, so not wherever Rome shifted, because Rome remained pretty much in the same place, and so saying goodbye also to the Byzantine Empire, the actual Holy Roman Empire and the actual Western Christendom, and so the spiritual hegemony of Rome that was truly founded in that imperial Catholic traditional sense that also predated Christianity, the broader Frankish world, I mean, at every level, arms and armor. Again, here it's a mix because it's essentially a Latin Germanic civilization, urbanization, the Gothic cathedrals, universities, mercantile, I mean, everything that you can imagine is topped by this system. So initially, remember, the historians craft this, there were other attempts to reunite the Mediterranean, but if you actually look at it in this perspective, if those were just the main examples you think of course I imagine that there were other minor ones you were thinking about. I mean, the Angevin hegemony, for example, in the second half of the 13th century is a big one. The same Hohenstaufen come pretty close to reunite Europe and the Mediterranean. These are all European attempts that I would have at least liked to have seen named, like the notion that in order to repeat what Rome did, like you just have to be like from the other side, like you have to be an Arab or a Turk, or even just it's about the Byzantines because the Westerners do not know how to run things and do not take over the same Constantinople, or not creating a civilization that is disproportionately powerful as homogeneous within itself. You know, makes you think, right? To me, you can say that, of course, the Western Middle Ages at large was the political territorial continuation of Rome in a strictly formal official statal sense, of course. But that, in fact, would be a mistake to begin with. Right? It's just like the question here. Rome was a holy city ruling over the world, or the various nations of the world. China at large was the Chinese Empire ruled and ruling over the Chinese, right? So what the European states, especially in the West, do in the Middle Ages, in my opinion, is first of all collecting the Roman legacy from both a spiritual, religious, and an imperial point of view at every level. I mean, Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII, the Pope, the beginning of the 14th century, claimed to be Caesar, both of them, meaning literally not something empty or strange, but that they had the imperium, which was the entire thing around which, like, truly the traditional powers revolved around in a metaphysical sense, including the Chinese one. And so even though if in that case we're talking about France and the papacy and different things, these powers were so intertwined, were so almost confederate to a degree through systems of alliances and general that is obvious between France, the papacy, Naples, the Tuscan, the Guelphs, Italian Guelphs. The same Holy Roman Empire had largely been this with Germany, Bohemia, Italy, Burgundy. More like think about how the Swabians inherit Sicily and how they threaten Constantinople that is conquered by different. I mean, you start seeing there that whatever the system was, it easily parallels Rome in terms of a homogeneous European power, regardless of its political unity. Which does not mean, okay, lacking political unity, so they were just weaker than the Roman Empire, right? No, you don't understand. Like, the empire, like the empire itself was manifest through this system, through this Franco-Roman system. That was the way this imperium sharing was managed and intended at the time. You can argue, of course, this last year just during the Middle Ages, because I think we mostly talk about this. During the modern age, it's different, but it can't be denied that Europe becomes ever more homogeneous as the centuries pass in that regard. So this is true for China as well. This is actually not true for other systems, depending on which ones we're discussing. Or at least it happens, but not at the same continental level of Europe. that today we are trying to make work as one in a way, because evidently we have so much that was really in common there 1,000 years ago already, 2,000 years ago already, or even before, and that we tend to downplay historically, because we maybe tend just to identify again the state in a strictly political territorial sense, one you can draw on a map as that actual form of power. As a medievalist, my few cents are on this, pointing on this, on the fact that regardless of the official titling of the Roman Empire, Europe and China remain Europe and China. And Europe is possibly even more cohesive, regardless, or exactly because of its differences, than the whole Chinese continuum as well. And in terms of literally of individual autonomy and power. I was thinking something great to say, but I forgot. It was along this pattern, so that, yes, I mean, the fact that in this sense, I think the Roman legacy is something that went far beyond the Chinese legacy. And that's yet another, say, incontrovertible fact, I would say, just to make the point that I think about the actual continuity of Rome, regardless of what we see in the Byzantine legalistic term. Of course, also Constantinople was part of that, but at the same time, it acquires more. You see, this is also the point I wanted to make, like regarding the conclusion that there was no steppe overlord the frontier. Ask the Byzantines whether there was, whether they weren't living on the frontier zone, and how many peoples reversed themselves on them as an avalanche, to the point of actually standing always their ground for a millennium. And as a smaller power, just think about. So this is not about getting rid of the Goths in the 4th century, in the 5th century, also sending them further west. This is literally at a point taking everything against and resisting, standing their ground. China, in that sense, failed, and Constantinople was a much smaller system. If we take China again, as I said at the very beginning, as approximation of a wall, right? So this video again is pretty much my impression on the thing, because I agree with more or less what is being said, not with some of its. And again, the author recognizes nobody has to forcibly agree or the thing being correct, and much to his credit. So it's not a criticism towards him, but it's like, this is how I would address the topic. This is how I would personally put people on, like the frame, the mindset they would use to approach this specific topic. It can be quite debatable. Like, I make this video, I mean, nobody ever responds me also because I don't make many commentaries or whatever, but I mean, oddly enough, nobody ever points at me saying, oh, this guy I want to respond, or I want to. I mean, I'm not searching for this from anyone specifically, but it's very strange that I got millions of views and nobody engaged with, I think, relatively valuable content, given that I don't know how many people are going to watch this video, because in part, as I said at the beginning, I did it also maybe for boosting a bit like the algorithmic views here, but I don't say it at the beginning, but I'm a PhD in medieval warfare. I studied, a bit of my life, certain things, and so it's not like also my ideas come really from nowhere. And so I think this was very interesting. I should do this more often because it's a way to challenge, of course, one's own preconceptions, and I personally would never make a video like that, especially 6 minutes long. So that I think today I proved what's kind of my comfort zone to explain things. But I'm glad that there are people who do this. Like, I often complain that YouTube history is a bit too superficial, and you did in 6 minutes. Yes, you can't even begin to answer, but let's say I wonder why my videos do not get 50,000 views just for 6 minutes of this ideas, and other channels do, of course. Of course, it's a different type of work. It works really differently. But just know that history is this long and nuanced, and this doesn't mean that you can't get to a conclusion of it, which I'm also about to reach myself for this video. But yeah, I had fun. Let's see if this has any effect. Again, I made very few commentaries, but it can be the beginning of some more sort of interesting idea. Now, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.